Although our benefit system backdates over 100 years, there was a time when the government had no intervention on how the poor and the sick were protected from poverty, homelessness, or even starvation. How did people without work or poor health survive? This film takes you back to the Middle Ages, when very little was done to assist the needy, and how royalty finally made decisions on who was responsible to aid the destitute of the country. Attitudes of poverty were very different back then. Let's look back on the history of the Poor Law. It was as far back as 1563 under the ruling of Queen Elizabeth I, where there was a law passed called the Poor Law, which insisted that poor people of the land were given aid by the wealthier. The responsibility was given to the parishes to collect the money, to which there were more than 15,000 of them countrywide, and disperse it to the entitled needy. During Elizabeth's reign, there were more acts served in order to assist the poor of this country. Poverty had risen greatly in 1560 due to the consecutive bad harvest years, which contributed to many job losses, and there was little food to go around, highlighting the need for change. Prices had increased due to the lower availability of crops, and money was more scarce than ever, so people had to move to the towns to seek employment, which was getting harder due to mass employment that was already there. More and more people were having to rely on charity in order to survive. The people were seen as idle by the community and were punished, with a more grim sentence by law with every repeated offence. Offenders were flogged, had an ear cut off, or were even executed for breaking the idle law in these ages. Begging was totally illegal, as it is to this very day, but the punishments were harsh and again could lead to an individual being hung in front of a public crowd. There was no compassion for beggars and vagabonds from the better off. In 1601, the law of donating to the needy was nationalised. It became compulsory for the parishes to collect from everyone who could afford to pay, and certain taxes were introduced to provide. This was the first time a national type of insurance was introduced, and with a few minor changes, this poor law would not change again until 1834. Under the Whig Prime Minister William Lamb, a new poor law was unveiled. This would be a national scheme which would even out the differences in contributions from parishes throughout Britain, so that no one was paying over the odds anymore, or indeed some areas had to increase their donations. Each parish would have to build a workhouse, so the needy would have to earn their supper, so to speak. Families that entered the workhouses were separated. Males and females would live and work separately, and children would also be in a different dorm. Children could be hired to work outside of the workhouses by being seconded to mining industries or given factory jobs. The separated minors were able to meet with their mothers only on a weekly once basis. This was known as an interview. Workers were known as inmates. They were given grueling work details and made to wear uniforms. The food was basic, and it was the lowest amount provided in order to meet basic nutritional needs. Most of the time it was tasteless and inadequate. The idea was to ensure that folk would do their best to improve themselves and get out of these places so they would have a better standard of living on the outside rather than in the workhouses. However, this did not deter, as some people came back time and time again. The policy was called the principle of the less eligibility. Families would starve on the outside so they became recidivists in order to sustain themselves. During this period there was abuse in the workhouses by its management, with underfeeding inmates and worse than humanitarian living conditions. It was reported that in one workhouse people were eating scraps of rotten meat from disposed bones. An investigation went underway to improve conditions. As more elderly and infirm came to the workhouses, there was less productivity as they were not forced to work. Those that could would do light duties such as clothes making or wool spinning. The workhouses were abolished in 1929, and finally in 1949 there were no more workhouses left. The early 1900s saw a new liberal change. Intellectuals John Hobson and Leonard Hobhouse helped investigate a new reform in the welfare of the British people. They saw the challenges of the poor were inhibited by little opportunities and economic climate. That would have to change, as there would need to be an interest in a strong combined welfare state. In other words, the better looked after they were and encouraged to learn a profession, the more chance that people would have to want to help themselves out of poverty. This was known as social liberalism. This is by the means of improving their circumstances of ignorance and with the amelioration of a collective effort from an interventionist state. This led to the Liberal Party getting a victory with Henry Bannerman in the chair, who in 1906 began the early signs of our welfare state. Reforms began in 1911 under Herbert Asquith, Prime Minister at the time, with compulsory health insurance for low-paid workers. The worker would pay 4 old pence if they earned 2 shillings and sixpence a week or more. The employer would have to cop up 3pence and the government would have to contribute 2 pennies. This would entitle the worker to claim for up to 6 months if they were unable to work due to illness. After 6 months ended, they got nothing. Also, the family members were not entitled to anything anyway. This was the downside, along with the fact that most people paid in more than they got out. Well, think of it. The original idea was profit-making for the government and its partners. Fewer people looked for medical assistance in those days. Medicinal costs were less expensive with a lack of sophisticated diagnostic techniques, and there was a much younger death rate. The scheme involved paying to unions and private insurance companies that managed it. It was a public-private business that made profits.